College football nerds here to do a little hypothetical LSU and Ohio State. We haven't done a lot of hypotheticals this year. There's been enough discussion in the regular games, but we thought this would be interesting given how much blowback we get every week for having Ohio State number one over LSU, in spite of Ohio State having a weaker schedule or not the resume that LSU has. So we're going to unpack that a little bit, talk about how these teams match up, because it's not just who's one, who's two. It's also how these teams match up, because sometimes a worse team can win because they can exploit certain things. So we want to get into that. I want to remind everybody we do an audio version of our shows. We try to get it out Monday, maybe Tuesday. It used to be later, but we're doing a lot better job. So iTunes, Android, even a link, direct link on our website, collegefootballnerds.com. So if you want an audio version and you don't want to look at my beautiful face, you can get those, iTunes, Android. But we ask you, if you love it, please give us a review. That would help us out a ton. That's the only thing we ask of you. Give us a review. If you hate it, no need to review at all. Just listen to it and go about your day. All right, Josh. One of the things that we've talked about with Ohio State this year is they've been entirely dominant, which people talk about how it's really hard to go undefeated in college football, and that's the hardest thing. That is not the hardest thing. It is not the hardest thing to go undefeated with Clemson's schedule. The hardest thing in college football is to consistently beat the crap out of teams that aren't as good as you and win and go undefeated. It's really hard to get 18 to 22-year-olds to be consistent week to week, especially when they know they can win. And Ohio State has done that, and that to me is the most impressive thing, and that's why I got them number one. But LSU has, and we're going to get into LSU's defensive issues in this discussion, and I know that's what Ohio State fans are going to just jump all over. And I'm not saying this is a negative for Ohio State. It's an unknown for Ohio State. But I want to tee this up and let you run with it, in that if there's one thing we don't really know about Ohio State, it's how they would fare against a team that has discovered that the forward pass is legal in college football. And I know it's funny saying that about an SEC team, but LSU's offense is on a complete other level from anything that Ohio State's seen, while Ohio State's offense is not on a complete other level from anything that LSU's seen. Now, LSU might still give up 40 points, but they've seen it. Is that a fair thing to say? And if so, let's talk about it.
I think it is a fair thing to say. So when you look at Ohio State's schedule, it's consistently good. It's not featuring a lot of elite teams across the board. Now, it's featured a couple really good defenses. Really, Wisconsin's, I would say Northwestern has been in that category, though they athletically kind of got completely exposed, I would say. But this kind of shows the problem right now with the Big Ten, frankly. It's not a shot at Ohio State to say this. The Big Ten does not have many teams that can throw the ball effectively. And I don't mean throw the ball well, just throw it effectively. Ohio State has kind of singularly exposed, in my view, Northwestern. They kind of exposed Michigan State, though that just showed up again last week. They exposed Wisconsin in their linebacker play. Teams can't really move the ball effectively through the air. They can't dynamically move the ball in the Big Ten. And I think it's to a certain degree why Minnesota has been so successful in the conference, despite the fact that they have some serious, obvious talent deficiencies in terms of total depth compared to some of their opponents, because they got a good quarterback and they've got receivers. That's what Ohio State has. So it's sort of shown two sides of the coin. One, Ohio State has done really well offensively, and one, they've done really well defensively, I think, as a result. When you talk about all this stuff, and we like to throw out rankings and ratings sometimes because we don't want to just sort of, throw this stuff out as a hot take out of thin air. Cincinnati is a good team. In SP Plus, they're 29th. That's good. I wouldn't say they're great. They're right behind Texas, even with all Texas's losses, even though with Texas's last loss. But what Cincinnati is they're a good, competently good defense, 33rd nationally in SP Plus. They're not a good offense, 52nd in SP Plus. The next one that's kind of close-ish, Nebraska at 45th. And it's easy to make fun of what LSU's doing in terms of their defense, in terms of giving up points. Mississippi State, who is not a good team, is 42nd in the country in SP Plus in offense. That would be a better offense than anyone that Ohio State has faced. And when you consider that Texas, who's not a great team, they're number 9 in SP Plus in offense. Their offense is actually quite good. It's their defense, largely due to mass. Over half the defensive starters have been out. Mass injuries has been a disaster, but the offense has actually been pretty darn good. I mean, you could go down the line. A&M is actually 17th in offense. Alabama, obviously, an awesome offense. They're 3rd. Florida is 20th. It's easy to make fun of a team like Florida, make fun of an Auburn. Auburn would be better. Auburn is one slot behind Nebraska, okay? Auburn's anemic, putrid offense in terms of its actual statistical production. I'm not talking about, it's easy to say, okay, SEC bias. This is a computer model. It doesn't care that they have the SEC moniker. It's telling you based off what they put on the field, they've been as effective as Nebraska. So that's the problem with Ohio State. Now, I think their defense has been dominant start to finish. I think they have great pass rushers. I think they have very athletic, sound linebackers. They're able to stop the run at a high level, and the secondary is extremely talented. I think they're an elite defense. They're number 1 in SP Plus in defense. But we've seen this before. Sometimes those defensive statistics do not translate when they haven't been tested and they do get tested. Michigan had a history of being a top 3 unit in SP Plus and getting boat raced every time they faced an offense that could actually throw the ball down the field consistently because their offensive scheme would suddenly get strained. Notre Dame in 2012, the reason that they had the result they did is that defense spent the entire season. We talked, this was kind of before when I was doing light blogging, but I talked about it at the time. They spent the whole season in basically a 4-3 set. And they played an Alabama team that could actually go 3 or 4 wide, even though they weren't fantastic at it, but they just couldn't compensate. They had they had no way to deal with a 3 or 4 wide set. So they had to go these nickel, their nickel or plus packages. And when they did that, they no longer could defend the run or the pass. I don't think that's going to happen to Ohio State given their depth, but it is a fair criticism. It is a fair point, and it's something that gives LSU a little bit of positivity that it's too easy to say that LSU's defense sucks. Ohio State's defense is awesome. The level of competition is just absolutely, utterly, radically different.
On the flip side, LSU's defense sucks. it doesn't. I don't think. Look, we were big defenders of LSU's defense up until this Saturday when they gave up 38 to Ole Miss, and part of that is because, look, giving up 41 to Alabama, there's no shame in that. We've seen this with Alabama Clemson games in these national title games. We saw it with Georgia and Oklahoma a couple years ago in that, as you said in our preview of Penn State and Ohio State, passing game travels a lot these days, and it's hard to keep an elite passing team completely down. I don't care that they gave up a lot of points to Texas or Alabama. I care that they gave up 400 on the ground. 38 points to Ole Miss, where, look, the defenses don't play each other and the offenses don't play each other. But so it's not fair to say, well, Ohio State's got an elite defense. They wouldn't give up 38 to Ole Miss, and we have said that. They wouldn't, and it is different because LSU would be playing Ohio State's offense. But that scares me because I like Ely. He's a good running back, but he ain't J.K. Dobbins. And so what I'm concerned with in terms of LSU is they're not Oklahoma 2018 bad, where they had the offense and they very well could beat you, 55-53, but there's going to be a day where that offense only puts up 30 points and you lose. I don't think LSU is that bad, but I could see a situation where LSU's defense is putting their offense in a pressure situation where they feel like they have to score, and then they can't call the game they want to call the game. And I could absolutely see that happening against Ohio State.
I think the biggest thing that's benefited LSU in some of their big wins offensively is Burrow was an extremely good and efficient manager of the ball game, and they've been able to really negate a lot of the blitz packages that have been thrown against them. They did it against Alabama, constantly finding guys that were open or, guys that were in the flat, and then let Edwards-Helaire make in that case. I think that was the Alabama linebacker Benton that coincidentally was sent to purgatory and didn't show up the next week. I was kind of curious to see if that would happen, and sure enough, it did. That occurred because teams that were playing had some issues, and two, it was their ability to kind of keep moving the sticks, keep going down the field. There's not a ton of pressure to score immediately, and they're able to just sort of, keep things going and score. Ohio State would give them two major issues. One, they're probably not going to be able to just dink and dunk and get first downs. Auburn did that to LSU. I think Ohio State would be able to be at least as effective as Auburn was in that regard. Keep everything in front of them. Use their front to generate disruptive plays. Obviously, Ohio State with Chase Young has the best pass rush in college football. Clemson may actually have a slight argument if you talk about top to bottom. They have a lot of really high-level guys. Georgia might have a little bit too. I think Ohio State's is better. But anyway, that's kind of where the offense is. The problem is defensively with LSU, they've struggled a little bit. And Ohio State's offense is really stinking good. I mean, they're, again, 4th SP+, right behind LSU, right behind Alabama, right behind Oklahoma. And that's going to put just as much pressure as LSU had in the Alabama game, only they're not going to be able to get the easy scores that they got in the Alabama game. That's a bad combo. So I don't think LSU is just going to get run out of the stadium by Ohio State's offense. I may take a little heat from this, but it's realistic. Alabama's offense with Tua Tagovailoa was better, I think, than Ohio State's offense. That's still an offense that can score 40 points on you. And so the question is, can they score 40 points against a defense that I think is significantly better than Alabama's defense? That's a hard undertaking. And that's where the sort of the matchups and all make a big deal. And it, again, guys like Chase Young, they can destroy a drive. And that LSU-Alabama game, if there was one big negative play on third down like that, because they had a Chase Young, that could have flipped the entire game. Ohio State has that guy, and that's the added pressure that's put on both sides of the ball for LSU.
All right, so since this is a hypothetical and it's kind of based on the model, why don't you go ahead and get into the numbers and see what the model says about this game, and we kind of can talk about it after that.
Sure. So not to restate it because we said it a bunch, that we might get some different traffic, I think, in this video. Our model looks at how you've done against your opponents in a comparative sense. So it looks at your opponent's strength, but it also looks at your performance in particular games, builds an idea of where what your team looks like in terms of strengths and weaknesses, builds a relational picture of how you're going to do in this game against this opponent. What are your matchup advantages? What are your disadvantages? It's not something where it spits out a straight numerical ranking, which is why we can't do a top 10 based on it. It's specific to this matchup at this time. And then to sort of simplify the discussion, when I generate a score, I don't use like a linear model. What I've done is programmed a system where, so to speak, I've got a bunch of variables, and the computer looks at each team's history and it figures out, okay, for your team, how much was this variable worth? How much was this worth? How much was this worth? And it generates all those variable numbers itself. I don't give weight for interceptions. I don't give it a weight for your run offense total, your pass offense total. I let it figure out how much that stuff's mattered to your team in the past. And it doesn't just do it in a linear way. It figures out, hey, when you get 7 yards an attempt, you'll score 40 points. But if you only get 4.5, you get 20. Because your team, if you're LSU with Les Miles, they consistently had to get really high yardage to score points because they couldn't throw the ball and convert first downs. If they weren't getting 6 to 8 yards a carry, they weren't moving the sticks. They didn't have a lot of explosive plays, so they had to be extremely consistent, and that required high yardage to be able to get touchdowns. Teams that are more spread, and you see this from Ohio State, they can score more points with less. And in fact, this year it's kind of interesting. Ohio State has only crossed 8 yards per play once in the Miami of Ohio game. LSU has crossed that threshold 4 times. But in those games where LSU crossed that threshold, they frequently scored less than Ohio State did. They had 10 yards per play against Florida. They scored 42 points. That same week, or I say week in terms of numbered weeks, it's probably not the same date. Ohio State had 7.7 yards per play, 3.5 yards per play less than LSU, and they scored 48 points, more than LSU did. So that's the kind of thing the model's picking up on. And where all this goes is effectively, Ohio State's defense is better than LSU's offense. LSU's offense puts up more numbers in the passing game, which helps them out a little bit than they do the run game. And why do I say that? Because Ohio State holds teams to 61% of the rush averages. LSU's only holding teams to 88%. I think the Ole Miss game kind of threw those numbers for a majorly out of the loop, but still wasn't really even great going into it. We've seen that a little bit. LSU has been run on by teams that can actually run the ball. They didn't play a ton, actually, of teams that could run the ball early in the season. It showed up later. But the biggest thing is run defense is something you can usually do ridiculously good job of in college football. Passing games travel better. Ohio State's 71% of pass defense is an elite number. It's just really hard to hold teams under that average. Last year's LSU team, I think, was somewhere around the 70 to 75% range themselves. LSU's pass defense is at 95%. They basically hold you right to your average every week. And those two things combined with the offense is how Ohio State gets a little bit of an edge here, because Ohio State averages 9 yards per attempt, which is great, but it's still not LSU's 10-plus yard per attempt pass game. So even though Ohio State is a much better run team, that doesn't matter as much when you start playing good defenses. They're still expected to get over 5 yards per carry. LSU's only expected to get about 3. But you can live on the pass game if it's effective. And Ohio State, 8.7-ish yard per attempt projected, is good. LSU's 7.1 is moving the ball, but not at a great clip. Now, it's thinking that Burrow, even at 7 to 8 yards per attempt, because this has happened, can still find ways to keep converting third downs because he's so consistent at finding the open man, about making his check downs efficiently, and they figures LSU will score 35 points. The problem is Ohio State is expected with over 5 yards per carry, over 8.5 yards per attempt to put up 44. So it has Ohio State 44, LSU 36.
It's worth noting the Alabama one was 44-38. I think if realistically, if these two teams played tomorrow, Ohio State would probably be about a 4-point favorite. Do you think that's about right?
4 or 5 points, probably, yeah.
Yeah, and to me, and what we always say is in a one-score game, it's really up in the air. It's a toss-up. To me, though, like it's a toss-up, and yes, anything could happen, but I do feel like because of what we're seeing with LSU's defense, and I would like to see LSU defense not immediately after a Bama game hangover, because I think that's also an issue. For example, I don't necessarily think Ohio State's going to play great against Michigan next week, and I don't think it means that they should fall. I still think they're the best team in the country. The thing that sticks out to me is really in the matchups, one, the model feels pretty comfortable about Ohio State's offense, and that's another thing we haven't seen is I do think Ohio State has played some good defenses, but because they've played such imbalance, they've gotten a lot of possessions, and they've gotten this thing where they start off slow like Michigan State and Wisconsin, and neither team could do anything with it, so ultimately they were able to squeeze out a lot of points and win big. But I also think it hurts them because they're having these monster second quarters, monster third quarters, and they haven't been in a lot of games where they had to play the full 4 quarters. So offensively, I almost think that the model's limiting them a little bit, which sounds crazy because I don't know that they'd score 44 on LSU. But I feel like they're being hurt a little bit because they're not playing for a full 4 quarters where LSU has had to. Because I think that in a big game like this, tell me what you, and I'm going to stop talking because I've talked too much, but tell me what you think about this. In a big game like this, either it goes one of two ways. Either there's so much pressure on the line and there's so much feeling each other out early that it's actually a pretty low-scoring game because the game is drastically shortened from that. They're both good offenses. They're going to drive the field a little bit, not go 3 and out, but they're filling each other out, and there's not a lot of points scored until maybe the fourth quarter, or it's an Alabama-Clemson situation where the offenses are operating at a high level even against good defenses, and it's kind of a track meet. Like, could you see, like, really nothing in between? Like, that's kind of how this game would go?
I could see almost anything coming out of it, and it wouldn't shock me. And we talked about this a little bit when we were doing the Ohio State Penn State example, that last year it had that game like 56-52, and it was 27-26, where it kind of had the margin right, but it was doubling the score. That was because it was very early in the season, which the model, like any model based on only on this season's data, is going to kind of freak out a little bit early in the year. I just don't know how the game would go. Now, I will tell you the matchup concerns I think would cause it to be lower scoring, honestly. It's LSU, in terms of their total athleticism defensively, is several notches higher. And we talked about this a little bit in terms of Penn State versus Wisconsin.
Several notches higher than who?
Than what Ohio State's played to date.
Okay.
Phillips and Stevens and Queen, they've struggled at times with their assignments a little bit. They've struggled with consistency, be it tackling, being physicality, but they're fast and they're athletic at a level that Ohio State hasn't played against. And that's kind of what we're talking about, where they were a little bit underrated, LSU. In like Alabama would throw a wide receiver screen in that Alabama LSU game, and they basically gave up on it because LSU started using Chason more as an outside linebacker than a true pass rusher. And he would flow to the ball so freaking fast that by the time the guy got the ball, started turning upfield, Chason was there to tackle him for like 3 yards. And, we'd commented on the fact that LSU really has struggled to generate a pass rush, and Chason's been out physicaled a lot. We've been watching games, and he's low-key gotten knocked on his butt, frankly, several times. But that's because he was being used as a guy that was trying to do power rush or rushing the passer. And I think they figured out that he's better suited, and their defense is better suited to swarm to the ball and just kind of concede the fact that they've got big defensive linemen, and they just need to occupy blockers to keep the blockers from getting to the second level and then flow to it. Obviously, that didn't work great in the Ole Miss game, which is a little concerning. But Ohio State's game is the zone read concept. It's throwing the ball horizontally. We talked about the issue a lot of teams have dealt with is how much Ohio State will use the full width of the field because of Fields' arm strength, and how much that strains defenses because they just can't move laterally. LSU can handle that lateral movement. For whatever their weaknesses are defensively, they can 100% handle that. They've got the athleticism to do it. And that's why I think it could be a little more low scoring, in the same way that Ohio State is able to generate disruption in the way that Auburn was able to do, which puts pressure and doesn't let Burrow make the decisions he wants to make. And if he dumps it off, then Ohio State's got the linebackers to run down and tackle like Edwards-Helaire. And if you just keep him to 4 yards per play, that RPO scheme, there's schematic issues. Basically, the fact that when you get near the 30, the safety now is compressed, and where you're currently trying to exploit that linebacker to safety gap, as you get closer and closer to the end zone, that gap shrinks and the RPO stops working, and LSU's kind of struggled in a lot of games as a result of that, save Alabama because Alabama's starting freshman linebackers. I think both teams could slow it down. And I'll flip this around to you. One of the concerns I would have, and I don't want this to turn into a stereotypical point, but offensively with LSU, there's an underrated point that their receiving core is huge. Jamar Chase is 6'1", 200 pounds. Justin Jefferson is 6'3", 192 pounds. Terrace Marshall is 6'4", 200 pounds. And they've got guys like Moss too. They're a huge receiving core, just physically. Do you think there might be some issues there? Because in the past, I've been a little critical with Ohio State, and I know that you haven't necessarily disagreed with me. Their secondary got pushed around a little bit by guys that were bigger and more physical because they've recruited more fast, high-twitch athletes, and sometimes they've struggled with guys that can jump over them on jump balls or are just flat bigger than them because they're kind of seemingly unused to it. Is that something you could see as something that would make it a more high-scoring game?
Yes, I think that one of the things that we talked about early in this discussion is, while I'm saying it's a question mark for Ohio State, I also don't believe in the complete 180 turnaround, poor defense to great defense in 1 year sort of thing. I think it's more likely to happen on an offensive scheme, offensive players than it is on defense. I think LSU's linebackers can be somewhat exploited too, The problem I have when we talk about things like wide receiver size or wide receiver advantages over the secondary, we saw this against Georgia last year in the Texas game. They had a considerable advantage at, like, their offense was 50-50 balls. LSU's is not, but their offense was 50-50 balls. We talked about this with KJ Hamler facing Ohio State, where he might have an advantage if he plays over Ohio State, but that's really only going to count for a couple of touchdowns. So at the end of the day, the high-scoring games for me are the situations where you just cannot keep a team off the field. And I think there's some of that in this game. But that, to me, more than specific matchups, is what would make me think it's a high-scoring game. I do think this would be a high-scoring game. Neither one of us are going to give a pick. I think this would be a high-scoring game. My gut tells me that if you're in a track meet, I think LSU's offense is a little better than Ohio State's offense, but I think Ohio State's defense is a good bit better. So that would make me lean Ohio State. But I just hate that we're not going to see Ohio State face a good passing team until the playoffs. That just really, that bothers me. I mean, just like it bothers me that Clemson's not going to play a good team until the playoffs. So there's some of that. And it's not Ohio State's fault. I just wish I knew a little more about how they would react against a good quarterback.
I'd agree with all that. And, again, in their defense, we've seen teams shut people down. I've often used the example of 2014 Ohio State up till last year, because then we finally had the example of Clemson. There are examples of teams that had a weak schedule, beat the crap out of the weak schedule. After the Virginia Tech game, Ohio State had an extremely weak schedule in 2014. They really did, but they annihilated them all season long. And our model had Ohio State beating Alabama. That's a tagline we used a lot, but it really did. And it was basically because it said, look, their competition wasn't great, but they played extremely well against that competition, much better than anybody else did. And so they're an awesome team. And I think a lot of what Ohio State does, like in pass defense, I don't know that they're going to generate the all-world pass rush, but they would generate a good amount of pass rush. And we've already seen the problem, though, is we've seen how LSU handled Auburn, for example, who has a very good defense. I don't think they're as talented in the back seven, but their front it's not an insult to Ohio State. Their front's probably about as good as Ohio State's, lacking a Chase Young, but all around probably as physical or disruptive. Auburn or Ohio State, one of the two is probably the best front in football defensively. I think Ohio State's better in the back seven, which could make more advantages, but I can kind of ding LSU because I know how they handled it. I can't even start to ding Ohio State or start to figure out how they're going to react. And that's the problem and the challenge here. We can be, and we probably will be in a playoff scenario, and I don't know if they'd end up playing an LSU or a Clemson. It's unlikely these two teams would play each other in round one, but we really won't know how they react. And I kind of feel like between Ohio State and Clemson, there's a really good shot that we're going to be shocked by one of them. Either one of those teams. Personally, I think Ohio State is just extremely good. I feel like this playoff scenario, and I've told you this a couple times, we're just waiting to see who Ohio State's going to murder in the playoff. I felt that way for about half the season. I think LSU's a really, really good team. I think Ohio State's just kind of a notch above in the way Alabama and Clemson kind of both were last season for most of the year. I think that could happen, and Ohio State wins them all running away, and everybody's kind of shocked because they think Clemson's that good or LSU's that good, and they haven't picked up on how good Ohio State is. I could also see it equally possible, like Clemson pulls a 2014 FSU and falls flat on their face. We don't know what these playoff games are going to look like. I think we're going to get to the playoff, and people are going to be very surprised by either how good some teams are, how bad some teams are, or probably a mixture of the two. But it's interesting to do a hypothetical and at least say, based off how you've done now, and I will say as a big caveat, one, again, this model had Alabama beating LSU by almost exactly the same score. But two, the model can't really deal, and I need to say this before I hand it back to you, the model can't cope with the fact that these teams are playing in different conferences. There's almost no scheduling overlap anymore in college football. The 9-game conference schedule, you can argue it's good in one ways, but I'll tell you one thing it definitely has done is it reduced the number of out-of-conference data points, which for us stat junkies, out-of-conference data points is how you stabilize or rationalize a model in one conference versus another. Fewer games now are being played out of conference, so those models are more, just less related. it's hard to compare these two teams even from a strict analytical sense. But I think it's interesting that they'd be fairly close, at least, one touchdown apart. I think it's interesting that Ohio State would be favored in a model over LSU, despite the quality of LSU's opponents. It takes that into account. And I do think it justifies why we've had Ohio State number one for most, if not almost all this year.
So real quick, 30 seconds. If Ohio State wins this game, if LSU wins this game, what's going to be the reason why for each team?
If Ohio State wins this game, it's going to be because their defense is able to generate a pass rush and then just consistently tackle in space. LSU beat Alabama, not really because they threw the ball down the field at all. They beat Alabama because they could throw it to Edwards-Helaire and he'd run over what was a supposed first-round draft pick at corner and carry him on his back for 12 yards and consistently get first downs. Ohio State has to stop that. For LSU to win the game, what they'll have to do is I think it would be their defense showing up and sort of neutralizing what Ohio State wants to do offensively. And I still have a major question if Fields can actually execute a traditional passing game where his RPO and zone read play action options aren't there, because while he has been an effective passer, he has not been asked to throw the ball by making reads and windows. The NFL concept is, if you're playing a really good defense, there are going to be times when guys aren't open, when coverages are mixed, and you can't throw to the first guy or the second guy. And that's just a function of good defense and good scheme. Fields has not been presented with that challenge yet. And that would be, I think, the thing that LSU could, or I would say would exploit in the hypothetical where LSU were to win the game.
All right, y'all, that's our sort of hypo preview of LSU and Ohio State. I think we'll have an opportunity to have this one for real. Y'all have one little bit of homework this week in this video. In the comments, let us know what you think the score would be and why you think the score would be that. And you can also tell us how crazy we are, how we got it wrong. That's totally okay too. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week and God bless.